Chapter 11, Genius. Lei shook his head after Fatty Lo. Though he didn't know anything about the plan, his brother-in-arms was as sharp as a razor when it came to marketing. His thick skin played a big role in that, no doubt honed by Master Lei's biting remarks at anything he had ever done. The old man had the habit of cursing and screaming at people's faces when he wasn't busy with his bakery, and his son got the worst of it. "All right, let's start." He pulled the cloth covering the kebab and turned the stick using the meat cleaver Fatty Lo had put over on the counter. Lei's collection of knives was rather lacking in this venture, so he'd asked his brother to bring him one of those big, long knives. Using the yellow maiden's eyes, he checked the cleaver. Common meat cleaver, good quality. Its edge, glinting sharp, was a testament to its quality. It didn't come as a surprise, as Fatty Lo hardly bothered visiting that butcher shop as of late, and Lei was grateful for that. He needed every help he could get. He turned the spit so that it faced the crowd, allowing people to see the glorious meat chops, all spiced up and tightened round together. Taking a last look around the square, he kindled the firewood and waved a hand toward the kids. "Form a circle," Lei said with a straight face as he counted the kids one by one. When they gathered behind the stall, he gave them a nod and leaned closer, just like that time his little loge coach tried to shove him some confidence even though he was barely more than a scarecrow against those pitchers. But this time, he was the coach and the ace, and he had a team of misfits smiling impishly up at his face. "Our game plan is simple," he started, heads down and eyes poked up at his words. "We have 10 tables and there are 10 of you. Talk it out and pick a table. For the whole night, you'll be responsible for that table and will deliver their orders. You know those waiters at the taverns? Tonight you'll be just like them. Smile and greet the customers with respect. Do we get to eat? Can we eat the leftovers? What if they say something bad?" Lei sighed out a long breath. Most of these kids were around 10 years old, thus a part of him felt strange using them as waiters. Surely this couldn't be seen as child labor, right? He was doing this for the kids, after all. Well, he was thinking of grinding the system too, but that didn't change the fact. "We'll all eat before we start serving the customers, so don't worry about that," Lei said. At the last restaurant he'd worked, they ate a family meal each day. It used to at least give him that much-needed break before all the chaos, so he was thinking of doing the same here. "And if they say something bad, you'll come to me and I'll deal with it. Don't ever try to argue with our customers." That got him a joint nod from the teen, with a questionable smirk and a wink in the mix. Desperate times, Lei reminded himself. However, this table and stool stuff wasn't originally included in his plan. Why did Brother Lu bring all these here? I could have just gone the old-school way of lining the customers up before the stall. But they did give the stall some semblance of a real restaurant, and it might just be the extra touch he needed to bring up the profit margins. 11 coppers was the name of the game he'd decided, and he had more than 600 coppers spinning round the spit right now. He started working on the bread, cutting them into halves. Then they all got their fix of cabbage, tomatoes, salt and pepper, and finally a touch of mayo. Just as he was busy turning the spit, a rough voice came from the back, "Lian Lei." Lei scowled as he turned toward the voice. The old man was wide on the shoulders and wide on the belly too, his robe stretched as though it'd break at any moment. He had a clean face, a shining pate instead of full hair, and a cave of a mouth that most old men had around here. "Old Wu," Lei greeted him with a half-acid smile. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" Old Wu jerked a thumb back at the stools and tables, face creasing into a frown. "You can't put those there." "Oh, why is that?" "We have rules here," Old Wu said, pointing at the other stalls around the square. "Nobody is allowed to put tables and stools before their places to keep the competition fair." "Fair?" Lei almost rolled his eyes. "Funny you mentioned that when everyone knows you got your place from that son of yours for some 10 coppers. Or was it 5? Old Wu crossed his arms on his chest. "If you want to complain, you can always go visit Little Cow in the governor's office. He's a good lad, I can tell you that. But this isn't about me. You're blocking a good part of the square with those stalls. Don't make me call the guards." "Look, Old Wu, I know you don't like me," Lei said, reaching with one hand and clasping the man on the shoulder. "And that's all right, 'cause I don't like you either. But jabbing each other like this isn't going to turn your awful fish into something glorious that'd sell like hotcakes. Have you heard of a thing called seasoning? If not, then let me part with you some advice. One chef to another, what do you say? You've no respect for your elders, you brat. Old Wu's face twisted up in cold rage as he slapped Lei's arm that was tied around his shoulder. You come here selling all those strange dishes, and now you want to lecture this old man. There are rules in this place. What rules? Lei clenched his hands. Where were those guards when 1/3 of the city got blasted into pieces? Where were any of you when dozens of children left orphans overnight in some fucking cultivator attack? Rules? You dare speak about rules to my face, you old goat? You... Old Wu stepped back, his eyes bulging out as though they were about to pop off of their sockets. The tiny hairs around his mouth trembled with rage, but a look around the other stores told him he was alone in this episode. So he snorted before fuming his way back to his stall, leaving Lei alone with a budding headache. I'm becoming more and more like these people. He must be one of the old monsters of the city, whispered a timid voice. Millimeter. Little Mai's voice answered. This city is full of them. Old monsters are everywhere. And why are they all old? Asked one of the kids, a look of dread flashing behind his eyes. Because they become monsters in time. Little Mai was too sure of herself as she stared at the group of children. When they were young, they were busy with work and had a lot of friends, but when they grow old, they usually become lonely and bored. Did you know? My grandfather was the worst of the old monsters. His face was full of thorns, and he would press my cheeks on those thorns even though it hurt. The oldest monster, another kid gasped. It must be terrifying. Little Mai shook her head. Thanks to him, I learned how to deal with them. You smile and do nothing, and they will leave you alone. But I think Lei knows better. He doesn't fear the monsters at all. No wonder he's the heavenly cook, said a sheepish voice. We should stay close to him. Then they all turned to stare at him with sparkling eyes, and Lei didn't know how to respond to that. He straightened his back and gave them a confident nod of his head, puffing his chest out for good measure. It was the least he could do. But they have it hard here, these old folk. To his knowledge, there wasn't anything like a retirement package in Jianjin, or in the Empire, for that matter. So once these people grew old, they had to either rely on their descendants or keep working in odd jobs here and there. That was why most of the stall owners around Eastern Square were old people. That gave Lei an edge in the competition, but also made his life a touch harder, as dealing with old people was a headache. This old Wu, in particular, was the worst of them all. He kept flaunting about his son who worked in the governor's office, too proud to acknowledge the fact that it was because of his son he had to work here rather than spending his last years drinking tea on some porch. I guess they don't pay too much to the postman these days. Shaking his head, Lei focused on the real task at hand. He turned the kebab and gave himself completely to the sizzling of the meats and the delicious wave of flavors that slowly spread about the square. There were a bunch of curious eyes gazing toward him, a raised eyebrow here and there, some talk about the meat stick that slowly wore its crispy shell while sucking up the tail fat juice dripping down through the sides. But it took more than curiosity to spend over 10 coppers on a straight dish, considering the times as they were. Still, Lei had faith in his gorgeous stick. Once the outer layer of the kebab cooked beautifully, he began slicing across the sides, letting the cuts rest over on the wooden base which was draped in juice. He then slapped the meat on the loaves, lining the portions neatly to the side for the family meal. His stomach had nearly consumed itself after all that work. Time for the family meal, gather round. Lei called the children to his side, gave each of them a loaf, and watched as they first took gentle bites before chomping on the bread like ravished little beasts. When Lei took his first bite, it instantly dissolved into a wave of flavors that trickled down through his throat. Perfectly salted and sauced, the play between mayo and the rich juice of marinated meat was a devilish jab at the ignorant palate of his soul brother, allowing him to experience the taste as though it was completely novel. And it was true when he thought about it. It was the first time this body got to taste something like this. Back in Lian Clan, most of the food was bland and honestly boring, which wasn't surprising as food wasn't that high on their priority list. It was mostly about exercise and meditation, with some lessons and education sprinkled in between, and they only ate to maintain this circle of monotony. It was then no wonder why they'd kicked his soul brother out of the clan. The expectation had been for him to become something, anything that would profit the clan in some shape or form. Joining a sect would be the best scenario, as becoming a real disciple brought about a heap of advantages. These included resources and the protection of the sect, which was a crucial thing to these always competing cultivation clans. An edge. An advantage. People are tools to be used for the grand benefit of the clan. Hence the motto, live for the clan and die for the clan. Lei was grateful that he'd found himself free of the shackles of a clan or a sect. That would have made his life miserable and probably pushed him into that bloody path of cultivation, a path that knew no compassion and love, instead fully focused on climbing the steep ranks and getting stronger, sometimes even at the expense of one's humanity. It must be hard to strive through all those steps and reach the zenith, only to look back and see there's nothing left in the wake of your clan. He shook his head as he finished the bread. Thinking too much about certain things was an old habit that sometimes wormed its way back into his mind without him noticing. He plastered a wide, beaming smile on his face when children came flocking around him with glinting eyes. Big Brother Lei, that was delicious. Heavenly Cook. He's the Heavenly Cook, not Big Brother Lei anymore. Either one is fine, Lei said, smiling down at their faces. Though he had to admit the name Heavenly Cook started growing on him. It had a good ring to it. It was just as he took his place behind the stall that he heard a commotion from beyond the square. A bustle of noises, excited and heated, echoed throughout the streets that made all heads turn to that side. What is happening? Little Mai asked, then she was on her toes, raising the cat so that it could see about the commotion. Little She, can you see it? The cat purred before wriggling impatiently, which made Little Mai put him back on the ground. Lei, on the other hand, could see the source of the sounds, but that only made him more curious. There were dozens of people far in that street, and the strange thing was, there wasn't a woman amongst their ranks. What? He scowled out into the crowd, crossing his arms on his chest. Then slowly the crowd parted, revealing the real reason for the commotion. A line of beautiful ladies marched through the street, clad in red gowns that fell awfully short of covering most of their powdered skin, with men in tow following each of their motions, afraid to even blink at this sight. And right between these ladies was a certain fatty who strolled with the confidence of a young master, chin raised high and a smug smile playing wide on his lips. When they crossed eyes with him, Fatty Lou gave Lei a wink. So that was your plan? Lei barked out a laughter. This brother of his was truly a genius in marketing. Chapter 12, Content. There was an odd beauty about the way these gorgeous ladies weaved between the tables, serving food with a shaded smile that did too good of a job at stealing these men's breath out of their lungs. Most of them were hardly aware of the amount they'd spent on some street food, which meant Lei had to check every cash coin to keep an order about the place. Some old guy had even winged him 100 copper cash coin without batting an eye, too busy trying to find his way through all that cloth and silk that revealed just enough to make his eyes sparkle. Half his teeth were missing, which should have made eating the bread a damn pain, but he seemed not that bothered today, nipping at the edges while cherishing the experience. The square was full of these men, older and younger, and Lei reckoned they'd never been this desirous to spend some coin on a street dish. Granted, there was a line of women clicking their tongues at the severity of the situation, but for this once, Lei had decided not to keep an account of the gender disparity between his customers. The pouring coins silenced the part of him that said this was a rather crude attempt at marketing. It worked, and the mastermind behind this devious plan had a certain expression on his face that told failure wasn't a possibility in the first place. He'd probably known exactly how effective this plan would be when he flashed that mysterious grin, and Lei was not at all bothered by his discretion on this case. So he worked with practiced ease, slashing through the meat stick while making sure all the sides were equally cooked and crisped up. His team of little cooks had taken a backseat role when the group of women came cleaving across the square, and now were helping him with the bread and keeping his face clear of any sweat. The leader of the misfits, Snake, and his faded sidekick, Stone, were busy waving banners of cloth embroidered with red silk that formed three striking words, the Heavenly Cook. As if it weren't enough, they both wrapped headbands around their foreheads and looked like Lei's personal mascots that somehow knew how to work the crowd that waited patiently in a line. 2 more up and ready. That'll be 30 coppers, sir. Lei smiled up at his next customer, a middle-aged man who hadn't found the chance to sit on a table and instead leaned his back to the stall, watching the dance triangle the ladies formed in between the tables. At each pluck of the zither, the ladies shifted a step, and something else seemed to shift in these men's hearts as they watched. Lei had so wisely adjusted the value of his prized goods, upping the original 11 coppers to 15 coppers, and even then he was now debating whether he should try to work up another 30 or so % raise. Seemed like it would be the wisest thing to do, but then he reckoned caution was warranted in this case, as he was aware that entertaining a crowd this big could easily turn bad if people started complaining. When the man gave him a 50 copper cash coin, Lei fumbled with his stack and returned him the 20 before finally stepping back to take a breather. Looked as though he'd sold over 50 portions in just under an hour, and the pressure slowly tightened around his chest as the crowd kept wolfing down the dishes. Oh, how easy it is to pluck the strings of a man's heart, don't you think? Fatty Lou said as he eased down near him, grinning out across the square. Give them a toy, something flashy to look at, then watch as they become spellbound like a bunch of children marveling at the promise of a new world. I should be a puppeteer or a master soulsman, if that's a thing. Soulsman? Lei snickered. That sounds rather ominous. Thought would be keeping away from unreliable practices like soul severing and head chopping. Fatty Lou waved a hand. It is perhaps a curse of mine, brother, to be always thinking of donning a greater robe over this mortal cage of a body. But I find a certain joy, an insidious satisfaction whenever I see the waves shift towards the way I imagined. Makes me feel like a god. Exactly. Fatty Lou snapped his fingers. This must be how those cultivators always feel when facing us the mortals. To think that you can be holding sway over life and death with a mere word is terrifyingly tempting. Isn't that true for everyone with enough means? Lei asked. It doesn't take becoming a cultivator to make a man's life miserable. You're not wrong, but it certainly makes it easier to get away with it, Fatty Lou said. Those demonic cultivators are all about that, right? Sneaky bastards always finding a way to save their skin from all the shit they do. Blast a city into pieces, then fly off to some forest by the sea and hole up inside a cave for 100 years. Then once you get back to your business, everything is forgotten and forgiven by the masses. Isn't there a word in the Empire that goes something like the Skyguard never forgets? Lei asked with a hint of doubt. Though he'd never seen those Skyguards himself, their reputation was definitely beyond the reach of their means. People thought of them as half-gods serving under the true Son of Heaven, the dogs of the Emperor himself, ready to carry out the justice of the true dragon at any moment. Fatty Lou shook his head. Spoken word will always be stronger than the real thing itself. Isn't that why people boast all the time? For all we know, these Skyguards can very well be a myth to scare bugs and beasts away. That's a way to look at it. Lei winced when the pressure grew heavier around his chest and started poking him like needles. It's happening again, right? Fatty Lou said with a frown. Tell me if there's anything I can do. Some water, perhaps? Or would you rather prefer one of our distinguished ladies accompany you? Trust me, they know how to use those hands. Lei gave him a straight look before sighing. I'll be fine. You go handle the customers, I'll be there just in a second. Fatty Lou lingered around for a second longer, then nodded and trudged away in silence, allowing Lei to focus on the growing pain that now coated his body like a thorny blanket. He felt that same cold sensation slowly seep through his skin, but paused when he thought about the night they tried the spirited fried rice. The chi inside that dish carried a similar cold, but for the lack of a better word, it was more composed. The energy or whatever the hell it was that came from people eating his dishes, on the other hand, was like the touch of a slimy snake that made his skin crawl. This is different from chi. It doesn't circle inside my body but instead gets sucked by something near my heart. The din of voices inside his ears slowly grew into a mixed buzzing that punched up at his mind, fingers of his right hand clenching round the stone step as he fought back the urge to scream. It was cold and got colder still, like a frozen blade twisting through his guts. Your tier has increased by 1 level. The screen appeared right before his face, then flashed blue in the dark of his lids when he clamped his eyes shut. He took deep breaths to gather himself, the left side of his chest throbbing as though it was alive. It took some time but finally, he felt the pain alleviate into the sting of a newly closed wound, and he found that much more manageable. With a shake of his head, Lei opened his eyes and peered out around him. His back was drenched in cold sweat, knees shaking and chest heaving with each breath. When he took the first step, the world decided to spin on him, but it cleared away soon after he trudged a little more, the pressure that had taken hold of his body wearing off in time. He balanced himself on the stool, resting his hands on the counter as his heart pounded in his chest. Then he slowly found his rhythm back into the business, the cold handle of the cleaver giving him a much-needed break from all that buzzing. If this continues, I'm going to break. Lei sighed and had some water to calm his nerves. There was an odd satisfaction, the sort of feeling you'd get while leveling up in some old-school RPG as he gained a new tier every now and then, but the pain seemed to be getting worse. I guess there's no gain without any suffering. The only solution he could think of to at least keep up with this sudden hike in agony was to make his body more durable. But without spiritual ingredients, let alone cultivating, he couldn't even feel the chi. That made him question if their clever idea of posting missions in the Adventurers Guild would bear fruit anytime soon. As Fatty Lu had said, Jianjin didn't have that many cultivators to speak of. Most who had some semblance of talent would venture dig toward the heart of the Empire in hopes of getting recruited by sects or the Empire itself. There were even academies, Empire-approved institutions that provided strict education in things like alchemy, formations, soul cultivation, or basic cultivation, but not everyone could get into such places. For cultivators to stay in a place as remote as Jianjin, it took more than just fondness of their hometown, hence why most cultivators in the city worked for the governor's office. They got paid richly for their efforts and owned properties in the center of the city that brought them hefty profits. They are more like merchants on drugs. Perhaps we should blame the Empire for this twisted form of society. In most of the novels Lei'd read back on Earth, cultivation or anything spiritual was beyond the reach of mortals, away from their touch like the clouds floating over the night skies. But the Eastern Chu dynasty's ingenious idea to implement a common currency had twisted the way of this world, made it so that cultivators and mortals live together and rather thrive together in some aspects. From the memories of his soul brother, Lei knew that you could buy a spirit stone in exchange for a golden coin in places like Lanzhou. This was the Empire's way of competing against martial sects, and despite all the complications it brought to the society, it seemed to have worked wonders for the Eastern continent in general. There were no great wars in the last years, save for the quarrels between sects and some trifles with the indigenous populace that lived high up on the mountains or beyond the borders of civilization. The late Emperor Xia was a genius, there's no doubt about that. He basically pitted all the sects against each other, making them compete over resources and territory while claiming most of the continent by working for the common good. Unfortunately, Jianjin hadn't been lucky to be blessed with such opportunities. "Big Brother Lei, is everything all right?" said a mellow voice, waking him from his thoughts. Little Mai's face was full of concern. "Is there anything I can do? Sometimes I wonder who's the real adult here." Lei shook his head and smiled at her. "I was just thinking about something, little Mai. There's nothing to worry about. Are you hungry? I can make another one for you." When Lei turned to the kebab, he noticed that he'd cut the last part of the meat some time ago. The spit was empty. But he took a breath of relief when he saw that they had enough for 2 or 3 portions laying on the wooden base. Little Mai shook her head. "I'm not hungry. I just wanted to check on you." "Oh, did you now?" Lei felt a smile on his lips. Thinking too much about certain things. It had been a curse of his old self, but luckily and strangely, there were enough people around him in this world to keep him away from brooding thoughts. He patted Little Mai's head before staring up at the night skies. "The stars. They are beautiful, right?" he muttered. Even against all the worries and uncertainties, he'd never felt this content in his life. Chapter 13, on the way. After one hell of a night, Lei and his team of little cooks strolled back to the ruins under the glistening night. Fatty Lu was with them, having decided to spend the night in Lei's modest house as he didn't want to wake Master Lei. The children sang songs all the way, hopping around them, while Snake and Stone carried the spit on their shoulders, faces creased with resolve. Lei, on the other hand, had held his ladle on one shoulder, his other hand holding another wooden container. 900 coins, he said, glancing at Fatty Lu. "You've outdone yourself once again, Brother Lu. Can't say I expected to see that much color tonight." Fatty Lu had a smug smile on his face as he stared at him. "A man has to show some spirit, don't you think? And I'll be taking 100 coppers from our haul, a little gift for those ladies, if you will." "Naturally." Lei nodded. 100 coppers for such a service wasn't anything short of a steal. Will they be interested in a long-time partnership with us? He asked with little hope. It's best not to get too greedy, Fadilo said. I was just lucky to hear from Uncle John that they'd be doing some restorations in the Moonlight Delight tonight. Or else even 500 coppers wouldn't have been enough for those ladies. Thought you'd stolen their hearts with your charms, Lei said and sighed as if disappointed. Guess this world too works on hard cold cash like many others. Fadilu gave him a side-eyed glance. Oh, our heavenly cook decided to impart us some knowledge of the realms beyond the reach of men, eh? Tell me, then, are they all messed up like this one? Lei thought for a second, then shrugged. More or less. Can't be that different, right? People are of the same mold, after all. Shaped and twisted by the heavens will, don't you forget, Fadilu said, waving a hand to Snake and Stein. At least in this world. Or how can you explain these two and that little one with the cat if we are all of the same mold? Circumstances. Lei said, but he didn't believe it himself. Not entirely, at least. Being born with talent could be considered as a gift on its own, but Lei wasn't sure if being talented alone should be something to be glad for. Say you're a talented man, say you're a damn genius, then what? What would you do different than those cultivators? For one, I would gladly take my leave from their strifes with my chin held high, Fadilu said, raising a finger. Then I'm thinking of a heavenly manor, some fairies, and your food by my side. Not that mortal shit, mind you, but something spiritual. You'd take me as a chef, then. Not as a chef, no. Think of it like a close friend who happens to cook all the time. Fadilu eyed him with a slight smile. From this blasted wreckage to above the heavenly clouds. I call that a quality change, no. It depends, Lei said. Will we be able to tread upon those clouds or fly across the skies? Or would you rather chain me into that manor of yours after getting your mind twisted up by all those spiritual drugs and the power to, I don't know, build a damned manor over the clouds? Look, you're thinking too much into it, Fadilu said, then paused and shook his head. You know what, I think you're not thinking too much into it. I mean, if we are immortals in the said scenario, then you can easily grow 6 arms and 3 heads, or split your body into 3 or 4 copies for them to do the hard work, right? You don't have to actually cook the food yourself. Where's the fun in that? Lei said. Is that why you want to become an immortal? To do nothing at all? Fadilu looked conflicted, but that lasted only for a second. You're missing the point. I'm talking about not doing all the hard work. We can pass the time by shooting stars or having some dual cultivation with ladies. Or play with a spiritual beast or two, ride a chillin just for the fun of it, maybe. Lei shrugged. In a way, being super rich and becoming a real immortal seemed oddly similar. But then, Lei had little idea about what immortals were really capable of. If they could, say, change the reality with a wave of their hands, then perhaps it'd be hard to resist the temptation to play with certain fates or certain worlds to pass the time. It would definitely be different than taking a jet to some faraway island or peering out into the wide skies from behind the glass windows of a penthouse. Perhaps we should aim a little lower, Lei said, and earned a sigh from Fadilu, but inside, he couldn't help but think about the future. Felt different now that they had something to work on. It was never an easy thing to find your way through an alien world, but the month he'd spent here showed Lei that he had, in fact, what it takes to survive in these rather curious times. You have to make the best of it. He let a smile crease his lips. As they wound through the ruins, the children started searching for a safe-looking place to pass the night. They might have been too afraid to stare directly at old G's wrinkled face, but they were clever enough to pay heed to his warnings, careful against the thugs haunting this side of the city after sundown. Lei knew these thugs were mostly scavengers, people who either got on the wrong side of the heavens or were cursed right from birth with the life of an orphan, turning them into outcasts who'd been shunned from society. There were some bad ones caught in the mix, though. Stay close to each other. Lei called out when one of the little devils wandered a touch too far into the distance. The sky was full of stars, but it wasn't enough to light the place. So, about these imps, Fadilu said, glancing at him. I think we can get a big place for about 400 to 500 coppers, but you have to live with them. You know nobody's going to rent that place to these orphans. That's the plan. It was bad enough that they had to pay 6 months of rent upfront to get the key, but rent prices also went completely insane after the assault, with people who survived the ordeal flocking into the other parts of the city. Or you can always get a permit from the governor's office and build yourself a shed or two here, Fatty Lou said, then nudged him with an elbow. But better to stay close to me. This back and forth is killing me. You just want a place to crash after a long night without bumping into your old man. Lei knew that too well. But yeah, I don't want to stay here either. It's too dangerous. He paused when a shadow shifted beyond a half-broken wall, followed by a creaking sound that probably came from the wooden planks that lay near it, a door, or at least what was left of it. But the night breeze wasn't strong enough to make them dance. Snake, stone, put that thing down, Lei said, keeping his voice low. The children gave him a questioning look, but he urged them with a hand after putting down the wooden container. Take the others and get behind me. What's wrong? Fatty Lou asked, looking around him. Lei gestured with his head to that broken wall, some 10 feet away to the right side. There's something there. I saw it move. Fatty Lou tensed and stepped back. Lei tapped with his leg to the wooden container he'd just put down, and Fatty Lou nodded before opening the lid and pulling the meat cleaver from inside of it. The cat hissed. Lei snapped his head back at Little Mai. Shush that cat and be quiet. Little Mai nodded with a blank look, then whispered some words into the cat's ears, but the animal seemed to have been fixed on that same spot, refusing to shut up. Let's go, Lei said, inching slowly forwards. There might be a stray monstrous beast roaming the ruins for a quick snack, and as far as he knew, human meat was rather high on their diet list. Beast attacks weren't that common, but not unheard of, either. We need to be cautious. As they trudged silently together, Lei kept an eye round, ears poked up to catch any minute sound, one hand clasped tight around the ladle's handle. Fatty Lou had his eyes fixed on the shadows, the cleaver catching the light of the stars, glistening sharply. Their nervous expectation was broken by an occasional whisper or a chuckle, usually stifled before Lei could turn back and scold the little devils. We should find a house, Lei said, heart pounding in his chest. Find a house and stay inside until we'd be sure there's nothing out here. Makes sense, but I've yet to see a solid wall, let alone a full house. Fatty Lou frowned deeply. This place is fucking dead. Don't start with that again. Lei sucked in a deep breath. Just for this night. Tomorrow we'll be gone. Fine, I know. Fatty Lou waved a hand at him. They crunched down on pebbles and pieces of wood, the sounds of their passing echoing far and wide into the long night. If it was a monstrous beast or something entirely else that was out to get them, then there was no doubt it knew wherever the hell they were. Deep breaths. Perhaps it's your imagination. Could be some drunkard, dozing off behind a wall. Or some rat. Yes. That must be it, a rat or a squirrel. But do they have squirrels here? Dan, a rat it is. A big one, for sure, perhaps a monstrous one. A magical rat. Shit. Felt like his own thoughts had turned their backs on him, trying to mess with his mind. Every single rock or a broken piece of wood looked a good enough place for a monstrous rat to hide behind it. And if it was a monstrous rat, then there was no way they'd be facing a single one. These things lived in groups or swarms. Flocks? Take deep breaths. But taking them, they did him no good. Eased his heart a little, but his skin was still tense as a fully drawn bow. The only thing that gave him some solace was the heaviness of the ladle. It was a spiritual tool, after all, not an average cookware. Just as they rounded a corner, a clapping sound echoed, then came the source of it. 3 men stood in front of them, faces hidden behind black scarves. Sheets dangled from their belts, metal glinting from under the worn leather as they regarded them with open disdain. Shit, Fatty Lou said, raising the cleaver. Who the hell are these guys? Thugs, Lei said, looking over his shoulder to check the children. His eyes widened when 2 shadows broke out from the ruins, glancing at the children like savage beasts, swinging axes as they circled the group. They looked crude and worn, those axes, but Lei reckoned they had enough edge about them to make it hurt. Look, we don't want any trouble, he said, raising one hand to the scarfed man. Just let us pass, we have children here. But you something else, too, a heavenly cook, said the one in the middle, a head taller than the rest of them, slanted eyes flashing with a cruel glint from under his bushy brows. He drew the sword, running a finger through the metal, before pointing it at Lei. You've made quite the killing today. Some 1,000 coppers, was it? Around 900, boss, said the one on the right side who had a big mole under his right eye. A nervous silence settled between them as Lei considered his options. There were 5 of these bastards, and he had a dozen children behind his back. 3 of them were at the body tempering stage, but other than to lift some heavy things, they couldn't be considered as true cultivators. Just some kids who got lucky. Lei glanced at Fatty Lo. His brother-in-arms had a savage look in his eyes that told him he wouldn't back away from a fight. That would have been reassuring if not for the fact that Lei himself had no experience against a sword or an axe, however crude they looked. The most he'd done was to punch some drunkard back when he was young, and to call it a real fight would be an exaggeration. All right, he said, reaching for the money pouch. About 1,000 coppers, all the money he had in the world, resting inside that damn pouch. If he gave it to these bastards, he'd be left with nothing. He gazed at the scarfed men. They didn't look the type that would give them a simple beating if they tried to do something stupid. He'd lose an arm or a leg at best and at worst. Let's go with nothing. I can work with nothing. He cursed under his breath. There were no guards, nothing in sight in this desolate wreckage. A part of him wondered if they'd done something to old G. Killed the man, maybe. He shook his head. Old G didn't have anything with him to become a target for these men. We'll give you the money, Lei said and threw the pouch to the tall man. Take it and let us pass. Bushy took the pouch and weighed it on his hand before passing it to the big mole. Good, now let's talk some real business, he said, raising a finger to the children. I don't want much else. Just 2 or 3 of them will be enough. I found that these little ones have the deepest potential to become reliable assets. They come with a blank slate, you see. Easy to punch some sense into them and make them listen, unlike these fools. His men grumbled at the words, but none had tried to raise their voices. Seemed the boss had an iron grip round them. Smelled like trouble. Take the money, Lei said with a straight voice, but was surprised when he couldn't hear the pounding of his heart. It had eased back into its usual rhythm. And let us pass, he finished, clenching the ladle further. Bushy waved a hand to his man. Take those 2 at the back, he said with the ease of a man speaking about plucking flowers. And the girl with the cat. She is just the face for it. You piece of shit, Lei muttered. There was a pressure, some sense of urgency inside his mind that got lost in the middle. So he clutched the ladle tight in his hand and fixed the group with a scowl before turning to Fatty Lou. Seems like we've no other choice but to fight it out. Figured that much, Fatty Lou said, then cracked his neck. I'm fucking ready. Chapter 14, Nod us. There were 5 of them, a fact that Lei kept reminding himself, with a dozen children caught in the mix, staring blankly about themselves. Only Snake and Stone got that image of someone getting ready for a fight, and Lei reckoned he might have to split his attention in order to keep them away from dashing into these bastards. Disappointing, said Bushy, his voice a tad harder now. You're not leaving us with much choice. Bite me, bitch, Fatty Lou said and shrugged when Lei gave him a look. That earned him a barking laugh from the scarfed men, and also made Lei question the ladle in his hand. What do I do with this thing? Just swing it around and hope it'll crush some bones. That ought to do it, or else he'd be swinging punches and kicks against swords and axes. The one metal wasn't as nearly close to being a trusted weapon, but looked heavy enough that any hit with it should leave a man in pain if Lei could somehow learn how to fight in a split second. They didn't give him that second, however, as Bushy waved a hand to his men, after which Big Mole stepped forward and cracked his knuckles. Lei shared a look with Fatty Lou, and they both nodded. At least he wasn't alone. That was a good thing. He'd get bashed and beaten with his brother-in-arms by his side, meanwhile the kids could run away. They would patch their wounds and drink the pain away if they could survive this sudden increase in tension. They are not going to kill us. That isn't likely at all. Likely. So it was that time to speak about life and death as if they were all possible outcomes. But as seconds crawled past and the group of thugs slowly came at them, all his thoughts gave way to a muted tension. Bushy the boss stood behind his group and seemed too proud to lay hand on some cooks while he had his men for it. So it was Big Mole who greeted Lei with a simple punch. Must be a cocky bastard if he thought of him not worthy of a sword, instead coming at him barehanded. Lei shook his head and focused. He poured everything he had into the ladle and swung it round into a great arc that connected with Big Mole's arm from the side. It sunk deep into the man's elbow with a sickening crunch, followed by a loud crack that made Big Mole's eyes grow wide, with Lei's eyes growing even wider as they both reeled back from the impact. Big Mole's arm hung limply from his shoulder, his hand fixed in that punching motion, but his elbow bent rather hideously to another side. "Is that a bone?" Lei asked and blinked before finally registering that Big Mole's shirt had been torn with the tip of a bone sticking out from that unnatural bent of his elbow. A shrill scream echoed as Big Mole crashed on his knees, holding his elbow near his face and staring into that bone, a tear or two trickling out from his right eye. His face twisted in pain, then squirmed with lack of breath as he gasped himself into a coughing fit. It was then that another body joined Big Mole's agony, a tall man holding his stomach as though somebody rammed a mace through it. Nothing was bloody, but Fatty Lou's pose as he stood with one arm stretched out, holding the cleaver's blunt side, his knuckles all white round the handle, showed the real reason behind the scene. "What?" Lei asked. "How?" Fatty Lou pointed at the broken bone of Big Mole. "I don't know," they both said at the same time, but their shock at each other's performance was broken up by Bushy's roar that awfully sounded like a war cry. Then the children were running, stone and snake throwing rocks to keep another fad busy. Nimble kids with devilish moves, Lei thought, as they played around the thugs like fish in the sea. "Get away from that man!" Lei jabbed with one finger into the air, screaming out of his lungs. "Don't let him catch you!" When those two broke away from the thug, Lei turned to his side, his body lighter than ever, his hold around the ladle strong and steady. He sidestepped by pure instinct when some metal came flashing at his face, turned, and found that it was actually an axe, singing a deadly song an inch away from his ear. He held the ladle right on the hand holding the hilt, the worn cook were whistling through the air like an owl, and it crashed down on the fingers and the axe with a loud thump. Lei's whole arm went stiff for a second, and he had to drag the ladle back with his other arm as his body refused to collaborate. Inside, however, he felt a deep, almost primal satisfaction that came from breaking bones. Was perhaps cutting and cooking all that meat had made him durable against anything bloody in the general sense? Could that be the reason why he didn't feel a damn thing at the sight of that bloody stub of fingers that got tangled with the crushed handle of the axe? But it was draining, that sense of satisfaction was. Slowly and painfully something else crawled from the depths of his core. He started shaking, staring round himself in full panic, his fingers dull and senseless, the ladle too heavy in his grip. Smeared with blood and the soil beneath his feet. What the hell was happening? And why, amid all this mess, did he have the time to pay attention to Fatty Low as his brother-in-arms hauled a man over on one shoulder, then hurtled him away like a sack of potatoes? "Who are you?" Bushy said, and it was his ghastly face that made Lei aware the man had been left alone on his feet, his aides either lying listless on the ground or staring foolishly into a broken arm or a finger as though simply looking at the bones would make them magically fix themselves. "I'm curious myself," Lei said, glancing at Fatty Low. Then he pointed with his head to the groaning man who got handled like a spoiled 3-year-old by his brother-in-arms. "Were you always this strong? And why would you try to throw an adult man like that when you can use the cleaver? It just..." Fatty Lou sucked in a sharp breath, staring wide at his hands. Seemed even he couldn't believe what he just did. Felt right. He came at me in such a way that I couldn't help but spin him backward and send him sprawling on his face. Didn't think it'd make him fly. That sounded reasonable enough, so Lei gave him a pass. But this time, it was Fatty Lou's turn to question some things. "What is that ladle?" he asked, narrowing his eyes at the worn metal that had left a clear trail on the ground while Lei was dragging it away. "If I didn't know any better, I could have thought it a spiritual tool." Lei averted his gaze away and blew strangely a breath into his hands to spark some feeling in his numb fingers. It helped only a little, but it was a start. "You can't be fucking serious." Fatty Lou said, dashed closer and tried taking the ladle away, then winced under its weight and poked a finger into Lei's right shoulder. "Is this related to your..." He stopped, stared around, and leaned closer before whispering, "Boon." Lei decided a nod would be enough for now. He didn't have the time to explain in detail. Not that he had enough details to make it sensible for Fatty Lou to understand. And they had another thug to deal with. Bushy looked strong-legged and strong-spirited too, considering he'd remained fixed on that same spot while his man had been dealt rather awful hands in mere seconds. "Get down on your knees and put your hands on the ground," Lei said, raising the ladle into the man's face. He nudged the groaning thugs with his leg, turning them around and checking if they still had some fight in them. But his brother wasn't as gentle as he was. He huffed his way round the wriggling worms and started jabbing the cleaver's handle into their faces, making sure they were all out cold before spitting on them for good measure. He then gathered all the swords and the axes, piling them over on the side before hawking a mouthful straight into Bushy's face. "Get down on your fucking knees," he said when the man stayed silent, his eyes darting left and right. Bushy crushed down on his knees under his intent gaze, placing his hands on the ground as he gave Lei a trembling glance. He had that shocked look of a headless chicken, no doubt considering what the hell went wrong against some cooks and a bunch of children. Not the group you'd expect a strong retaliation from, and that, Lei could understand. "It's not fair at all, right?" Lei muttered, staring at his own hands, shaking after the adrenaline left his body. It was cold now, and it came from within, too deep for him to do anything about it. So he tried to take it all in, letting the seconds do their thing as his heart pounded in his chest. "What are we going to do with this fool?" Fatty Lou said with a deep frown, then reeled back and slammed the cleaver right at the nape of Bushy's neck with all his worth. That earned him a groan that got muffled by the pebbles and the dust the man choked when his face got plastered on the ground after the impact. "We'll take them to the guards," Lei said. Carrying weapons alone was a major offense, one which was often punished by a hand or two. But looting and kidnapping, now these two would be more than enough to get them hanged. "Please," Bushy said, and choked and pleaded a second after, "I'll do anything you want. Just don't let me. I'll cut your fucking tongue." Fatty Lou yanked the man by his hair, eased near to his face, and hissed at his ear, "Do you hear me? I'll fucking cut your head if you say one more word." "All right, easy now," Lei said when he heard the footsteps from the back. He turned and tried to smile as a dozen little faces came under light, shocked, senseless, and shivering like little pups. He raised an eyebrow when he saw how hard Snake clenched his jaw, face red as a beet, trying to keep a strong front before his brothers and sisters. "You've done good." Lei reached and pulled the boy to his side, pressing him tight into his stomach. He could feel the fear that caught him hard as the boy was shaking like a leaf bearing a winter breeze. The others didn't look much different, so Lei smiled down at them. "Come here, all of you." He stood there under the stars, hugging the children as they wept silently. Orphaned and left homeless, but the world still refused to give them a break. A place where they could live like normal children, Lei was thinking, a place where they would be safe and sound, away from all the shit that governed this twisted world. But then doubt crawled back into his thoughts, making him question if he had what it takes to care for a bunch of children. He'd near killed a man just now and had done it without blinking. It all started to come back at him, jabbing at his heart one by one. He glanced at Fatty Lou. His brother-in-arms had the same savage look on his face, focused on the thugs that lay all around him. Not a single tear Lei could find in those eyes. Just when he thought he found a path of his own in this forsaken city, the heavens or whatever the hell it was kept reminding him how alien he was in this world. Life wasn't worth much around here. People got killed or lost all the time. "Not you," Lei muttered. "Not us." "What did you say?" Fatty Lou asked. "Nothing." Lei shook his head. "Get the children back to your place. Then fetch the guards," Fatty Lou said, staring up at the sky. "I bet those fools are sleeping sound now." Chapter 15, Aftermath. "So what was it again?" "You said these poor guys tried to kidnap some children from the ruins," said the short guard, a little wide on the sides, his face riddled with pockmarks and adorned with an awfully thin mustache that fell quite short of delivering the hard look this guard surely thought he'd get. Lei nodded for perhaps the 10th time, going over the explanation yet again. "They tried to take our coins and the children. Said the little ones made for good workers, or something like that. You've seen the swords, sir, that alone should be enough to get them locked up in the governor's prison." "You're right. They don't have the permit or the status to carry weapons." The guard blew out a long breath, a drop of sweat trickling down through his marks. One could have thought he was the one who carried these bastards all the way down the ruins from how he kept yawning in front of the pair of them. The only explanation for his lack of interest in this matter could be that he didn't like it. Simple as that. When Lei woke him up, as the man had been busy slumbering in the corner, he had to listen to his tirade about how hard it was to become a guard, and how little they got paid for the work they'd been trusted with, which was to deal with thugs and make sure the city didn't get razed to the ground. Oh, wait. The city was razed to the ground. You're not too good at your job, then, eh? Lei shook his head. A part of him knew that a simple guard couldn't hope to stop some demonic bastard whose breath would probably be enough to erase his existence. He wasn't even a cultivator. Another part of him, though, couldn't just accept the fact that these fools, the guards of the city, were simply a useless bunch. This plump guard, for example, had just the look that told Lei that he was some officer's nephew who got recruited into the force with a little push from the higher-ups. Nepotism at its finest. You've got the rest, then. Fatty Lou said and hawked another mouthful to the line of thugs, who were still smarting from the bruises as they kept mumbling like junkies. Not bushy, though, as he had an easy expression on his face as if he was simply waiting in the line of a street vendor. They'll be put on trial first thing in the morning, the guard said, yawned, stretched, and checked half-assedly the chains binding the thugs to the metal bar that ran the length of the wall, before waving a hand toward the exit. Chief would want to listen to your statements. One of you will be enough. I'll do it, Fatty Lou said and shrugged when Lei glanced at him. The sun's here already. You go and get some rest. Check those little devils for me. Sure you don't want me to stay? Lei asked one more time and trudged out when Fatty Lou gave him a nod. Outside the guard station, Lei took in the chilly air as he rubbed his shoulders. The first lights of the morning were about to break through the dark, so he wanted to pour himself over the ground and lay there sleeping, but he also had the mind to check the kids. At least we've got our money back. The city was rather lively even this early in the morning. A bunch of drunkards sang songs, arms locked together, as they swayed this way or that, blissful smiles of bad sleep away from crumbling into grave realizations. Lei watched them as they seemingly decided to spend the night under the big statue of some minister of the state, whose name was lost on him, that stood right in the middle of the square which sprawled before the guard station, depicting an old man who had the whiskers of a flood dragon. But they didn't forget to blow a whistle to the two ladies who passed by them, dressed up in fancy clothes, spreading a wave of aromatic perfume about them. Shaking his head, Lei made for the ruins, mind heavy with all sorts of thoughts. Sure, there was the guard station, a governor's office, and even a law that governed the empire, but these things weren't enough to spark a sense of security in him. On the contrary, it seemed like death was all around him, just that he'd managed to fall at this time. But it was hard to say what had happened if or when he'd come across real cultivators, rather than some miserable thugs. Would that spiritual ladle be enough to ward off the real ones? Not likely. There was the system, and it promised too many things, none of which he had the resources for. Spiritual ingredients, was it? He just had to be reincarnated into the remotest of the places when that higher entity could have easily sent him to the capital, which many called the immortal city. I should be grateful to get a second chance. This whining isn't going to get me anywhere. That was true, but for the last month he'd been pushing himself for all his worth to do something with this second chance, so maybe what he needed was a little breather. Take the day off. Allow himself to rest. He'd earned it, right? Got enough money to fix a place for the kids now, there was that. Yeah. You've to be optimistic. I'm making good progress here. And who knew? Perhaps their mission would bear fruit soon and he'd start making another spirited dish. He'd gotten a real kick out of that spirited fried rice, and it wasn't just the che. That thing seemed alive, something more than a mere dish. It was an expression of his knowledge, mixed with the magical side of this world, the perfect combo to Lei's thinking. There must be hundreds of ingredients out there. Thousands of things I've yet to explore. You've to keep your head up and running. That's the key here. It was easy to say, of course. Back in the house, Lei found the children sleeping soundly inside the cramped space, scattered like a bunch of stray cats all across the ground. Stone seemed to have thought Lei's work would be as good as any pillow, one cheek flattened out over the metal cookware, tongue lolling out lazily. Snake was resting with his back on the wall, arms crossed over his chest. Seemed as if he'd dozed off waiting for Lei, as he had that same scowl on his face that made him look like an angry older brother. The only one who welcomed Lei was the black cat, and even then the animal only spared a tired look at him before getting back on Little Mai's head where it closed its eyes again. They'd experienced way worse before. Hence why they probably didn't have any trouble sleeping like babies after the eventful night. Lei didn't know if that was something to be glad about. On one hand, these kids had to be mentally strong if they wished to survive in this cruel world, but on the other hand, they were damned kids for God's sake. They should have been playing, running about, and chasing each other like normal children. Let me prepare something for you. Lei felt a little smile settling on his lips as he slowly, carefully pulled his spare wok from the top counter and placed it over on the makeshift stove. He still had some eggs from the other day, but he'd used the last of the tomatoes for his kebab venture, so menemen wasn't on the table. Sunny side-ups, then, for the morning. He used the leftover cottonseed oil and kindled the firewood before placing over 10 eggs near the stove. Then he cracked them down on the wok when the oil got that first wave of heat from the wood, sprinkling a pinch of salt as a last touch. The eggs popped and crackled, and it wasn't long before a tiny head craned near him with curious eyes. "Morning," Lei said as Snake gulped loudly while staring at the eggs. "You've kept them safe as promised and watched over them. That's what I call being a good big brother, there. Very well done." Snake's eyes darkened as he took a step back, glancing up at Lei with gloom. "That's the only thing I'm good at, big brother Lei. Watching them like a coward. But I couldn't do anything when those thugs tried to take them away." "Nonsense," Lei said, a bit louder than he would have liked, which he compensated by pulling Snake closer and ruffling his hair. "These things take time, little Xianxia, so don't be too hard on yourself. And what kind of a coward would try to fight a man twice his size who also carries a sharp axe? You were brave enough to distract him. You and Stone both. It's thanks to you guys would manage to handle those people." Snake lowered his head, but Lei could see the promise of a little smile on his lips. Still, there was some hesitation that warranted an extra push to convince him to believe those words. "I couldn't have done it at your age," Lei said as he gave the wok a little shake. When Snake's eyes snapped back at him, he tried hard to keep his face straight. "And your big brother Lou? Well, he's a different man, so he probably would have done the same, but yeah, you get the point. Goes without saying that if you'd gotten proper training, you could have easily handled those thugs with one little tail." "Training?" Snake asked, tilting his head. Lei nodded. He was painfully aware that these children weren't in a position to think about the future, but he also knew he couldn't just leave them to their own after placing a roof over their heads. Talent was hard to come by around this part of the world, and these children, at least a bunch of them, had what Lei thought was a real gift in them. But he couldn't force them against their wishes, thus he decided to probe Snake about what he thought of becoming a cultivator. "Say, little Xianxia." "Snake," he said, puffing his cheeks. "You'd promised you'd call me Snake, big brother Lei." All right, little Snake," Lei said, and chuckled when Snake hunched his shoulders. "Now tell me, if you knew you've got the talent for it, would you have tried to study at a school?" "School?" Snake shook his head. "I don't have the time to waste on studying meaningless things, big brother Lei." "Then what do you want?" Snake trailed off, then mustered his courage before looking straight into Lei's eyes. "My father had told me once that everything in this city is about money. He'd said that if you have enough money, then nobody can say no to you. So that's what I want. I want to earn money and become someone important. This way, little Mai and others can live happily without suffering." "Money, is it?" Lei said gravely. Snake was 12 years old. Age wasn't the same number here as it was back on Earth, but still, he couldn't be considered an adult before passing the age of 16. It was way too early for him to start thinking about things like money. Desperate times. "But I'm not talking about a normal school," Lei said, as he removed the wok from the stove, setting it aside for it to cool down a bit, before turning back to Snake. "What about cultivation schools? I've heard with the education you get in those academies, the possibilities are endless. You can, say, become an officer of the Emperor's Own. I've heard those people earn quite the money. And there's one such school in Lanzhou." Snake looked doubtful at first, as if thinking about it, then shook his head. I've been to Lanzhou once with my father. We went there to sell the crops. He'd always say you can get higher prices there. Worth the trip, he'd say. They have a school, but it's weeks away from here. I can't leave them alone, he said, looking back at the others. You're too responsible for your own good, little snake. I'm afraid there's not a future in which all dozen of you attend the same school or stay in the same place. Sooner or later you'll have to part ways. But the simple conversation showed Lei that Snake wasn't ready to think about his own future. His mind was full of the responsibility that he carried on his little shoulders. Lei could only hope that when they got a place in the city these little ones would start to shed their insecurities bit by bit. A place in the city. I don't think I'll have the time to sleep today. We have to find a place right away. He'd have to visit the city to see about the options. But before that, it was time for breakfast. Go wake your brothers and sisters, he said to Snake, to which the little devil nodded with a smile and started barking at the others like a drill sergeant. They floundered up and swayed away under the assault, but Snake didn't give them a chance to say anything and dragged them to the table. Once everyone was seated, he gave a curt nod, and Lei thought for a second that the kid was about to salute him. He sighed out a long breath as he placed the wok on the table and pulled out the leftover bread from the other day. It didn't take long before they started wolfing down the eggs, mouths too stuffed to utter anything other than blissful chomps.